The evening began like any other community event. The kind people attended out of habit more than excitement. Families arrived slowly, moving through the open doors of the concert hall with the calm pace of a routine they knew well. Some greeted neighbors, others found their seats while chatting quietly, and a few looked around with the polite boredom of someone expecting nothing unusual. To them, it was just another night of performances, something they had seen many times before. As the audience settled in, a soft buzz of conversation filled the space. People discussed their long day, their children's school updates, and plans for the weekend. No one seemed to pay much attention to the list of performers printed on the small paper programs. Most people didn't even look at the names. They simply assumed the night would be the same as every other year, some good acts, some not so good, and all of them blending together into one long memory. Backstage, however, someone stood quietly by herself, holding onto a worn music sheet with both hands. She had arrived early, far before the rest of the performers, because she needed the extra time to steady her mind. She had practiced this performance for months, sometimes late at night, when the house was silent. It wasn't just a performance for her. It was something deeply personal, something she carried in her heart with careful weight. She watched the other performers talk with each other, laugh lightly, and fix their outfits. She didn't join them, not because she didn't want to, but because she was too focused on the moment ahead. Her hands felt cold as she held her music sheets, and she breathed slowly, trying to calm herself. She had played the piano many times. This night felt different for reasons she couldn't fully explain. The sound of the host's voice reached backstage as the event began. The audience clapped politely. The first performer stepped on stage, and the young woman closed her eyes for a moment. She listened to the faint echo of music drifting in from the hall. It wasn't fear she felt. It was something closer to pressure, a pressure she had placed on her own shoulders. She wanted this performance to matter. She wanted it to reach at least one person in the crowd. Inside the hall, people shifted in their seats without much thought. The performances so far were fine, but nothing unusual. A child whispered to his mother. A couple shared a quiet joke. A group of students tried not to laugh too loudly. The mood remained light, casual, and almost indifferent. No one suspected the night would soon change. Backstage, a young woman kept adjusting her fingers, stretching them carefully, like she always did before practicing. Her breathing grew slower as she watched the act before her coming to an end. Through a small opening in the curtains, she caught a glimpse of the bright lights shining down on the stage. The sight made her heart beat faster, but she did not step back. She simply stood still for a moment and reminded herself why she was here. She had lived most of her life quietly, rarely drawing attention to herself. Many people didn't know much about her, except that she seemed gentle and preferred to stay in the background. Sometimes people confused her quiet nature for inexperience, as if silence meant she had nothing to offer. But in truth, she had more depth inside her than most people realized. Music had been her way of expressing things she could never say out loud. When her turn finally arrived, a backstage assistant gave her a small nod. She stepped forward slowly, walking with careful steps, the wooden floor beneath her feet making soft, almost hesitant sounds. As she reached the edge of the curtains, she took one long breath and pushed through. The audience barely reacted when she walked onto the stage. A few people looked up, but most continued whatever they were doing. The evening had already been long, and she didn't look like someone who would suddenly amaze them. She had no dramatic entrance, no bright costume, nothing that demanded attention. She looked simple, almost plain. Standing alone under the warm glow of the stage lights, she reached the piano bench and sat down gently. For a moment, she didn't move. Her eyes hovered over the keys, as if greeting old friends. She placed her hands lightly above them, feeling the smooth surface of the ivory beneath her fingertips. The room still hummed with scattered conversations and shifting movements. But she didn't look at the crowd. She didn't search for approval or attention. She simply closed her eyes for half a second and allowed herself to remember why this mattered. The piece she had chosen was one she had practiced countless times. It wasn't the easiest piece, and it wasn't the loudest or most dramatic, but it carried a kind of emotion she connected with deeply. It told a story of hurt, hope, and quiet strength. She wanted to play it not to impress anyone, but because it felt like a part of her life. When she pressed the first key, the sound was soft but clear, like a breath released after holding it too long. A few heads turned slightly. It wasn't enough to stop the room, but it was enough to feel like something had shifted. Even if only a little. She continued, letting the melody flow naturally from her hands. She played with gentle control, the notes weaving together like threads in a delicate fabric. The crowd began to slow their conversations. Not because they expected something remarkable, but because the music had a strange calmness to it. She didn't notice them. She didn't look up. She kept her eyes on the keys, letting each movement speak for her. The sound carried across the room in a steady rhythm. Rising and falling with emotional weight, people started turning their heads toward the stage without realizing it. It was not a sudden shift, but a gradual quieting. The melody pulled at their attention, asking nothing from them, yet giving something gentle and warm. The young woman continued, unaware of the small changes happening in the audience. She felt connected to the piano, as if the world around her had softened. The notes wrapped around her like comfort, reminding her of the late nights she practiced alone. Of the difficult days when music was her only way to breathe. The room, once filled with casual noise, now held a different atmosphere. It was still not silent, but the chatter had slowed. People sat with more stillness, her ears catching the soft emotions woven into the little details of her playing. She reached a part of the melody that always made her heart tighten. It was a part she had practiced carefully, one she feared messing up. Her fingers hesitated for just a moment. But then she let go of the worry and trusted herself. Her playing deepened slightly, carrying more emotion. It was not dramatic or showy. It was simple but honest, which made it feel more real. The audience began to sense something different. The notes didn't just sit in the air, they carried a feeling, something gentle but meaningful. Even those who weren't paying attention at first slowly found themselves listening, but they still didn't understand what was coming. They thought this was just another performance, another act in a long list. They didn't know that the story was about to turn, that the quiet young woman on stage would soon hold the entire room in silence. For now, they simply watched her without expectation, unaware that everything was building toward a moment none of them were prepared for. And backstage, beyond the glow of the lights, the next performers waited casually. Assuming her segment would pass like all the others, no one knew that the night was quietly shifting, note by note, into something they would talk about for a very long time. But for this moment, she played on, unaware of the turn the night was about to take, unaware of the attention slowly gathering, unaware that her quiet presence would soon change the room entirely. All she knew was the music, and the music knew her. And together, they filled the hall with a calm, steady emotion that no one expected, but everyone was beginning to feel. Backstage, she sat quietly on the small wooden bench, listening to the distant applause fading as the act after her finished. Her hands rested in her lap now, still a little warm from the piano keys. She wasn't thinking about how the audience reacted, not yet. She was simply letting her breath settle, letting her heart slow down after pouring a piece of herself into the music. She didn't know that her playing had already planted something indescribable inside the room. She looked down at her fingers, gently curling them and stretching them again out of habit. For years, she had practiced in silence. Sometimes in her room where the sound barely reached the hallway. Sometimes in an empty classroom at school after everyone went home. Music had always been her way of understanding life, especially when she struggled to express things with words. Her mind drifted back to how it all started. She didn't come from a family where people bragged about children's talents or rushed to enroll them in expensive classes. She grew up in a small, quiet home where responsibilities came before hobbies. She remembered the first time she touched a piano at a neighbor's house. She was still very young, and her fingers didn't know what to do. But even then, she felt something. Something she couldn't explain. Something like a connection. Her neighbor had smiled kindly and let her try a few keys. She remembered being embarrassed, unsure of what to play, but the gentle sound stirred something in her. It didn't matter that she had no training back then. She felt something familiar inside those notes, as if music understood the things she didn't know how to say. As she grew older, she found small ways to practice whenever she could. She helped her neighbor with chores just to earn a few minutes at the old piano. Sometimes she played quietly so no one could hear, afraid that someone would laugh if she pressed the wrong key. She felt shy about being seen, especially when she wasn't confident. In school, she often sat alone at lunch, not because people disliked her, but because she didn't know how to join conversations that jumped from one topic to another so quickly. She preferred listening, observing, staying in the background where she felt safe. Some students mistook her silence for weakness. Others simply forgot she was there. But music never forgot her. Music always welcomed her without questions. That was why this night mattered to her. It wasn't about impressing a crowd or proving anything. It was about honoring the years she spent building something quietly inside herself. It was about honoring the moments when she wondered if her dreams were too small or too strange. It was about one final promise she made to herself, that she would stop hiding as she sat backstage now. She didn't know that the audience had fallen into unexpected silence during her performance. She didn't know that people who barely looked at her when she walked on stage were now whispering about the strange feeling they felt from her music. She didn't know that the room had shifted in a way no one predicted. She was still the quiet person she had always been, sitting alone, unaware that her world was slowly opening. In the audience, the mood had changed. Most people didn't realize it yet, but they felt different. Something about her performance, even though she didn't play with dramatic flair, had touched something simple and very human in them. They couldn't explain it, but they felt a little more attentive now, their minds a little quieter. A man in the middle row leaned back in his seat, replaying the moment in his head when she pressed the first key. He hadn't planned to listen closely. He had come only because his children wanted to attend the event, but when she played, he felt something familiar, something he hadn't felt in years. A woman near the aisle sat with her program resting on her lap. She had been flipping through it impatiently earlier, waiting for the event to finish. But now, her fingers touched the edges of the paper without turning a page. She wasn't sure why, but something about that soft, emotional melody stayed with her. A group of teenagers who had been whispering and laughing earlier were now talking about her performance. They didn't speak loudly this time. They spoke with something closer to curiosity, maybe even respect, though they didn't say that word out loud. Backstage, she slowly stood up, smoothing the sides of her clothes. She didn't know if she should stay or go back to her seat in the audience. She wasn't used to being part of events like this. She often felt like an outsider, even when she tried her best to fit in. One of the backstage helpers stopped beside her and gave her a small smile. It wasn't a dramatic compliment or anything special, just a simple smile that acknowledged her presence. She nodded politely and stepped aside so the next performers could move around. She walked to a quiet corner and sat again, wanting to watch the rest of the performances from behind the curtains. She didn't know that some of the performers who were about to go on stage were now whispering to each other about the soft melody they had heard from the hallway. "Did you hear her?" One whispered. "Yeah, that was different." Another murmured. They didn't say more. They didn't need to. The event continued, but nothing felt the same anymore. The performances happening after her were good, but the audience didn't react the way they did before. It almost felt like everyone was waiting for something else, even though they didn't know what. As she listened from backstage, she didn't judge or compare. She simply watched quietly, admiring the courage of everyone who stepped onto the stage. She knew how hard it was to perform in front of people. She understood the pressure and the nerves. She respected every person who tried. But inside her, there was a growing sense of something she couldn't understand. It felt like her heart had opened a little wider. She didn't feel invisible in the same way she normally did. She didn't feel small or out of place. She felt like she belonged here. Even if just for this night, she let herself breathe that feeling in for the first time in a long while. The hall slowly changed again as the night moved forward. There was a moment when someone walked up to the host and whispered something. The host nodded with interest. The young woman didn't notice this from backstage, but a few audience members did. They leaned forward, wondering what was happening. Meanwhile, she closed her eyes, listening to another performer's gentle singing. She felt calm, not realizing that someone had stepped behind her. "That was beautiful," a voice said softly. She opened her eyes and turned slightly surprised. It was one of the older volunteers who helped organize the event each year. They smiled warmly, their eyes soft with sincerity. "You played with a lot of heart," they added. She didn't know how to respond. Compliments always left her unsure. She gave a small nod and whispered a quiet thank you. "You should be proud of yourself," they said. She didn't know if she should believe that, but hearing those words warmed her chest. The volunteer walked away, leaving her alone again. But now she felt something different, something like a quiet glow. As she remained backstage, the night moved steadily toward its midpoint. The audience continued watching, but their attention kept drifting back to thoughts of her performance. They didn't know why it had affected them, but it did. Some felt comfort. Some felt memories resurfacing. Some felt inspired without knowing what inspired them, and some simply felt at peace. She didn't know any of this. She simply sat with her hands folded, unaware of the impact she had just made. But soon, the atmosphere in the hall would shift again, even stronger than before. And her quiet presence would no longer stay in the shadows. She didn't know that people would begin to look for her. She didn't know that the host had something unexpected planned. She didn't know that the night was building toward a moment that would change everything. For now, all she knew was that she had played her heart out, and without realizing it. She had already woken something in the hearts of the people listening, something no one expected. Something that would only grow stronger as the night continued. The lights on the stage dimmed slightly as another performance came to an end, and soft applause filled the hall. People clapped politely, but their minds were elsewhere. They were still thinking about the quiet young woman who had played earlier, the one they did not expect much from. Something in her music had stayed with them, like a soft echo that refused to fade. Backstage, she remained seated near a corner, unaware of the shift happening outside. She had no idea the audience had been talking about her in small whispers throughout the night. She thought the people clapping for the next performer had simply moved on. She didn't know that many of them were comparing each new act to her unexpected melody. The host stepped onto the stage once the applause settled. Their voice echoed gently across the hall as they made a few short announcements. Most of the audience listened, though many were only half focused. They felt a quiet anticipation that they couldn't explain. Something inside the hall felt different now, but no one knew how to describe it. Behind the curtains she could hear the muffled voice of the host, but she didn't pay much attention. She was busy calming her nerves after performing, trying to convince herself she hadn't made any mistakes. She replayed the entire performance in her mind, worrying over tiny moments that no one else noticed. She wondered if she had pressed one key too softly. She wondered if the audience even cared. She wondered if they had felt anything at all. But outside, how the audience had cared more than she imagined. The host glanced at the program list, then looked out at the audience with a thoughtful expression. They paused before speaking again. The audience leaned slightly forward, sensing something unusual. "Before we move to the next part of tonight's program," the host began, "I would like to acknowledge someone who surprised us in the best way this evening." The hall became still. People exchanged curious looks. Even the performers backstage paused to listen. She lifted her head slightly, wondering who the host was talking about. She assumed it was someone else, someone more confident, someone who always drew attention effortlessly. "Earlier," the host continued, "we witnessed a performance that carried a kind of quiet emotion we don't often see." Now the audience knew exactly who the host meant. Whispers moved through the room. A few people nodded to each other. Some smiled softly, remembering the piece. Backstage, her heart started to beat faster. She pressed her hands against her knees, unsure if she should stay still or stand. "Her music reached all of us," the host said, "in a way we didn't expect. And though this wasn't planned, I believe, the evening wouldn't feel complete without giving her a moment of recognition." She froze where she sat. The backstage helpers exchanged glances. One of them whispered her name quietly. She blinked, stunned. "We would like to invite her back on stage for a brief moment," the host announced. The entire hall erupted into applause, louder, warmer, more eager than anything earlier in the night. Her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't ready. She didn't know what to do. One of the volunteers gently touched her arm. "They want you back out there," they said kindly. She shook her head, slightly overwhelmed. "I don't know if I should. You should." The volunteer replied with an encouraging smile. She stood slowly, her knees unsteady. She felt like the world had suddenly moved too fast for her. She didn't understand why they wanted her back. She didn't think she deserved it. She didn't know how to take in applause meant for her. But the sound of the audience clapping didn't stop. If anything, it grew stronger. She stepped forward, each breath filling her with more nervous energy. The curtains parted, and she stepped through them again. Blinking under the warmth of the stage lights, the audience rose to their feet. It wasn't planned. It wasn't forced. People simply felt moved enough to stand. Her eyes widened gently. She wasn't sure where to look. Her hands folded together as she tried to stay calm. She had never imagined anything like this. She had prepared only to play, not to be acknowledged. The applause echoed through the hall, filling every corner. People who barely noticed her earlier were now clapping with genuine appreciation. The host walked toward her with a warm smile. "Your performance touched many hearts tonight," they said softly. She lowered her head shyly. "Thank you. I didn't expect this." Sometimes the most unexpected performers leave the strongest impact. The host replied. The applause continued for a moment longer before slowly fading into silence. The audience settled again, ready to listen. "If you would like to say anything," the host told her, "you may." She panicked inside. She wasn't used to speaking in front of people. She felt her heart pounding loudly in her chest. But as she looked at the audience, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. They were not judging her. They weren't waiting to criticize. They were smiling, encouraging, kind. She took a small breath. Thank you," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't expect any of this. I just wanted to share something that means a lot to me." She paused. "I'm grateful you've listened." Simple words. Honest words. The audience clapped again, not as loud as before, but with a soft warmth that felt different, more personal. She stepped back from the host and walked off the stage. The moment she disappeared behind the curtain, her knees nearly gave out from the rush of emotions. A group of performers backstage greeted her with smiles she wasn't used to receiving. A few told her they loved her playing. Another said they felt inspired. Someone else said she reminded them of why they started learning music in the first place. She didn't know how to respond. She simply nodded, hugged her music sheets close to her chest, and whispered a quiet thank you to each person. But the night wasn't finished with her yet. As she watched the rest of the show from backstage, she noticed something strange. The audience was reacting differently to every performance that followed. They were paying more attention. They were quieter, more present, almost as if her heartfelt playing had shifted the tone of the entire evening with each act. She felt her nerves unwind slowly. She now felt more like a part of the event instead of a background piece. Every smile she received warmed her in ways she didn't expect. She had never wanted attention, but she had always wanted connection. And tonight, she had found it. But the true turning point came later in the night, after another performance finished. The host returned to the stage to announce a short break. The audience stood and stretched, but many stayed in the hall. Discussing the event quietly, someone backstage approached her, a teacher who had seen her play earlier. "I heard your piece," they said warmly. "You have a gift." She looked down, unsure how to handle the compliment. "I just practiced a lot." "You practiced, yes. But you also felt every note," the teacher replied. "That is something no lesson can teach." She didn't know how to respond. The teacher gently squeezed her shoulder and walked away. She sat again in her quiet corner. She felt both overwhelmed and strangely calm at the same time. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel proud. When the break ended, the hall slowly filled again. But before the event resumed, something unexpected happened. A small crowd gathered near the edge of the stage. These were audience members who had walked up just to ask the host something. The host listened, nodded thoughtfully, then glanced backstage. She watched nervously as the host stepped toward her. "They want to hear your piece again," the host told her gently. Her breath froze. "Again?" she whispered. Yes, the host answered. They said it would feel wrong to end the night without it. She shook her head in disbelief. But I didn't prepare for 2 performances. You don't need preparation, the host said softly. Just play the way you did before. That is enough. She stared at the piano from behind the curtains. The hall quieted as people returned to their seats. Some whispered excitedly, guessing what might happen. She swallowed hard, her heart pounding with fear and anticipation. Slowly, she stepped forward again as she reached the piano. She sat the same way she did before, quiet, calm, and full of emotion she didn't know how to express with words. The room fell into deep silence. She placed her fingers on the keys, then she played. And this time, everyone listened from the very first note. When the room fell quiet, she could feel all those eyes on her again. People who had ignored her earlier were now watching every small move she made, as if they were trying to understand how someone like her could make a sound that shook the room the way it did. She didn't look at any of them. Instead, she kept her eyes on her hands, gently resting on her lap, trying to calm her breathing. Still, the whispers returned, but this time they were different. It wasn't the mocking tone she had heard before. It was confusion, curiosity, and something else she had never expected from that crowd: respect. A man in a dark suit stepped closer to the piano, pretending he was only wandering around, but his eyes kept drifting toward her. A group of women who had laughed earlier were now leaning in, quietly discussing her performance as if they were trying not to admit how wrong they had been. But she didn't react. She only kept breathing slowly, letting her heartbeat settle. She had learned long ago that when people change their attitude suddenly, it's usually not because they understand you better. It's because they were surprised by something they never expected. The host walked toward her again, this time without the dismissive smile. His tone had softened. That was impressive, he said. The words sounded like they were forced out of him. She nodded politely, not trusting herself to speak yet. Her throat still felt tight from the way she had poured everything into that performance. The host continued. There's still one more performer before the break. I hope you can stay around. She knew what he was really saying. Don't leave the room. Everyone wants another look at you. But she only nodded again. The next performer came forward, a tall guy with sharp features who clearly enjoyed the attention. He winked at a group of people in the front row and sat down at the piano with a confident smile. He cracked his knuckles loudly and even took a moment to brush imaginary dust off the keys, as if to show that he was the real star of the night. She watched quietly. He started playing and his skill was obvious. His fingers moved fast, hitting every note correctly. The crowd nodded and whispered approval. But something felt different. His performance was loud, polished, and meant to impress. But it didn't have the softness, the story, the emotion she had put into her piece. People enjoyed it, but the room did not fall silent the way it had for her. Halfway through his piece, he shot a look in her direction, quick, sharp, like a challenge, like he was trying to regain the spotlight she had taken from him. She didn't flinch. She only watched him with a calm expression. When he finished, he stood up to loud applause. He bowed dramatically, soaking in every bit of the attention. But even he seemed to notice it wasn't the same kind of applause she had received. His eyes flicked toward her again, this time with a touch of frustration. He approached her after stepping off the stage. "You're good," he said, trying to sound friendly, but she could hear the tension under his words. "But you know, one lucky performance doesn't make you a real player in places like this." She met his eyes calmly. "It wasn't luck," she said softly. He smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see about that." Before she could respond, the host called everyone to a short break. People stood up, forming small groups, whispering and glancing her way more openly now. She could feel the shift in the air she had become the topic of the evening. She stepped aside and found a quiet corner near a tall window where she could breathe, without anyone staring directly at her outside. Lights from the city reflected on the glass, making everything feel distant and unreal. She touched the window lightly, letting the cold surface cool her fingertips. Her hands were still slightly trembling, not from fear, but from the intensity of the moment. She heard footsteps behind her. "You handled that well," someone said. She turned and saw an older woman standing a few feet away. Unlike the others, the woman wasn't staring with surprise or confusion. She looked at her with understanding, like she had seen something deeper in the performance. "Thank you." She replied softly. "You play from the heart," the woman said. "Not many people here even remember what that feels like." She didn't know how to respond. Compliments were always tricky for her. They made her more nervous than insults. The woman smiled gently. "Don't let them shake you. People in these places, they judge fast and regret quietly." She nodded. The woman was right. The room slowly filled again as the break ended. She could feel the energy changing. People weren't just waiting for the next performance. They were waiting for her to see if what they heard was real or some strange moment they couldn't explain. She walked back toward the piano area, not sure if she would be asked to play again. But knowing the night wasn't over yet, as she reached the edge of the stage, she felt a mix of nervousness and calm. She had already shown them a part of her heart. Now she just had to see what the rest of the night would bring. She walked back toward the piano area with a steady pace. Even though her heart hadn't fully settled yet, the energy in the room had changed again, and she could feel it the moment she stepped closer. People who had ignored her earlier now moved slightly aside, giving her a clear path, as if she suddenly carried a different weight in the room. She didn't ask for any of this. She simply loved music. But nights like this always reminded her how quickly people judge, and how quickly they change when something surprises them. The host stood near the microphone, scanning the room with a thoughtful expression. His earlier confidence had faded, replaced with something that looked almost like caution. When his eyes met hers, he cleared his throat and straightened his jacket. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "before we continue to the final part of the evening, I believe there's someone here who deserves a moment." A ripple of whispers moved through the audience. She felt her palms go warm. The host continued. "Some of you have already heard her earlier performance, and I think many of you would agree that it wasn't something we get to witness very often." People nodded. Others murmured. A few clapped softly. The tall performer from before stood off to the side, arms crossed, jaw tight. He kept glancing at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, part annoyance, part curiosity, maybe even worry. The host then looked at her directly. "If she's willing, we would love to hear one more piece." The room quieted instantly. She froze for a brief moment. She hadn't expected this. She barely had time to breathe after her first performance, and now they wanted more? Her hands felt warm again, not in a bad way, but in that familiar way right before she sat down to play something that mattered. She hesitated. Not because she didn't want to play, but because she knew what it demanded from her. Playing wasn't just pressing keys. For her, it was like pulling something deep from inside, something she didn't always understand or control, but she saw the older woman who had spoken to her during the break, standing near the back. The woman gave her a small nod, encouraging, gentle. It was enough. She walked toward the piano. The crowd watched every step she took. The sound of her shoes on the floor echoed faintly in the otherwise quiet room. She sat down slowly, adjusting the bench just a little. The keys felt cooler than before, as if the piano itself was waiting for her. She closed her eyes for a moment. Music, for her, had always been a way to speak when she didn't have the right words. Tonight, that silence inside her felt heavy. But she knew there was something she needed to let out. She placed her hands on the keys when she began to play. The first notes were soft, barely above a whisper. A few people leaned in without even realizing they were doing it. Her fingers moved slowly at first, like she was telling the beginning of a story. One she wasn't sure she wanted to share, but knew she had to. Then the melody grew. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't meant to impress anyone. It was gentle, warm, and full of memories. She didn't talk about moments that had shaped her, hurt her, strengthened her. Each note carried a feeling. Each pause held meaning. People in the audience didn't move. They didn't whisper. They didn't even breathe loudly. The room had fallen into the kind of silence that only happens when everyone is pulled into the same place emotionally. even if they can't describe what they're feeling. The tall performer's eyes softened as he listened. His crossed arms slowly lowered to his sides. He wasn't comparing anymore. He wasn't competing. He was simply listening. The host stood still, hands clasped in front of him. His earlier stiffness had melted away. Somewhere near the back, the older woman closed her eyes, as if the music was reminding her of something she had once forgotten, and she, sitting at the piano, felt everything she had kept quiet for so long start to lift from her chest. Her fingers moved with a calm certainty she didn't always feel in real life. Here at the piano, she knew who she was. She let the melody rise at the end, gentle but full, like a quiet promise, and then she let it fade slowly until the last note drifted off into silence. She didn't move at first. She kept her hands on the keys. The room stayed quiet, so quiet she almost wondered if anyone was breathing. Then someone clapped. Just one person, then another, then the room erupted. It wasn't loud, chaotic applause. It was full, honest, and warm. People stood up, not because they wanted to fit in or look supportive, but because they truly felt something. She looked down, overwhelmed. Her chest felt tight again, but this time from something soft, something almost like relief. The host approached her, there with a look she hadn't seen from him before. He wasn't pretending anymore. He wasn't doubting or judging. He was simply impressed. That, he said quietly but clearly, was extraordinary. She only nodded, still catching her breath. The tall performer stepped closer. He didn't smirk this time. He didn't try to be clever or competitive. "You play like it means something," he said quietly. She looked up at him. "It does." He nodded, a small, honest gesture. "I see that now." People gathered around her, not crowding, not overwhelming, just standing close enough to show they cared. Many of them introduced themselves, not with pride this time, but with humility. They thanked her. They told her how the music made them feel. Some even admitted they hadn't expected anything when she first sat down. She listened politely, though she didn't know what to say to most of them. Compliments still felt strange, but in that moment, she realized something. The night wasn't just about proving herself, it was about reminding. People maybe even reminding herself that real music has nothing to do with status or appearance. It comes from quiet places inside the heart. Places most people forget about when they get too busy trying to impress others. As the crowd slowly moved on, the room returned to its usual rhythm. She stepped away from the piano and found a quiet spot near the edge again. The older woman joined her with a warm smile. "You've changed the whole room tonight," she said softly. She shook her head gently. "I just played." That's exactly why, the woman replied. She looked at the piano one more time. The night wasn't over yet, but something inside her had settled. Now, everyone knew it wasn't just another performance. It was something they would remember. After the applause faded and the room slowly returned to its usual blend of soft music and scattered conversations, she felt the weight of everything settling inside her. The night had unfolded in ways she never expected. She came thinking she would simply play, leave, and go back to her quiet life. But something about the way people looked at her now made her feel different, lighter, but also unsure. She stepped away from the crowd, choosing a quiet corner near a long table filled with small snacks and water glasses. She reached for a glass, hoping the cool drink would steady her heartbeat. Her hands no longer trembled, but they still felt warm, as if the music had stayed inside her even after the last note faded. Across the room, people were still glancing her way, some with curiosity, some with admiration, and some with the kind of respect she knew they didn't give just anyone. It made her nervous, but it also made her feel strangely proud. A few minutes passed before the tall performer approached her again. His steps were slower this time, and his expression no longer carried the competition or sharpness it had earlier. Instead, he looked thoughtful, almost humbled. He stopped a few feet away from her. "You changed the energy of the whole night," he said. She took a small breath. "I didn't mean to. That's the thing," he replied. "You weren't trying. That's what made it real." She didn't know what to say, so she gave him a small nod. He seemed to understand that she wasn't someone who liked long conversations, so he didn't push. He simply offered a faint smile and walked away, leaving her with the quiet again. The host approached next. His steps were careful, almost respectful now, as if he didn't want to disturb her. His earlier arrogance was nowhere to be seen. "Listen," he said gently, "I owe you an apology. I didn't take you seriously at first. That was my mistake." She looked at him calmly. She didn't feel angry. She was used to people underestimating her. "It's okay," she said. He shook his head. "No, it's not. But I'm glad you proved me wrong." After a short pause, he added, "If you ever want to play here again, the door is always open." She appreciated the offer, but she didn't answer. She wasn't thinking about future performances. She was still trying to understand what this night meant for her. When the host left, the older woman approached once more. Her steps were slow, calm, as if she didn't want to rush the moment. "You handled everything with such grace," the woman said. "I just played," she replied softly. The woman gave a warm smile. And that's what made it powerful. People spend so much time trying to outshine each other in places like this. They forget that music isn't about showing off. It's about sharing something honest. You did that. The woman reached out and lightly squeezed her arm. It wasn't the kind of touch that demanded attention. It was gentle, reassuring. "Don't let anyone tell you that you don't belong here," she added. Her throat tightened a little as she nodded. She didn't know why the woman's words affected her so deeply. Maybe because they felt real? Maybe because she had heard the opposite too many times in her life. After some time, the evening program wrapped up, and people began gathering their coats and bags. Many stopped by to thank her before leaving, their faces softer than before, their voices sincere. She appreciated every small gesture, even if she didn't know how to respond to all the praise. Compliments felt heavy to her, not because she didn't want them, but because she never expected them. Once most people had left, she stayed behind. The room was quieter now, the lights dimmed slightly. A few staff members were cleaning up, stacking chairs, and clearing tables. She walked back to the piano and ran her fingers lightly along the keys, not playing, just feeling the smooth surface. This instrument had been the center of the night. It had carried her voice when she didn't have the words. It had stood between her and a room full of strangers who became silent when she played. For a moment, she closed her eyes again. She could still hear the faint echo of her own music inside her memory. It felt warm, like a quiet flame she carried with her wherever she went. The older woman approached once more, this time with her coat in her hands, ready to leave. "You'll keep playing, won't you?" the woman asked. She opened her eyes. "I always do," the woman said, smiling softly. "Because the world needs more moments like tonight. Moments that remind people to feel something again." The woman walked toward the exit, giving her one last nod before slipping out the door. The room was almost empty now. She sat down on the piano. Bench again, not to perform, not for anyone else. Just for herself, she pressed one soft note, then another. The sound was gentle, almost like a whisper. She wasn't performing this time. She was simply letting her heart settle. A staff member walked by and paused. "You don't have to leave just yet," he said kindly. "Take your time." She nodded gratefully. Minutes passed quietly as she played a soft tune to herself. Something simple and warm. Something that felt like a small goodbye to the night. She eventually stood up, letting her hands slide off the keys for the last time. She took a deep breath and walked toward the exit. The staff nodded to her with kind smiles as she passed. When she stepped outside, the cool night air touched her skin, refreshing and gentle. The city lights shimmered around her, and the streets were calm. She wrapped her arms around herself, not from cold, but from a feeling she couldn't quite name. Maybe pride, maybe relief, maybe both. As she began walking toward the quiet path that would take her back home, she realized something important. Tonight had changed her, not because people finally noticed her, not because she surprised a room full of strangers, but because she proved to herself that her voice, her music, was worth something, something real, something powerful. They had thought it was just another performance. They were wrong, and deep down, she finally knew it too.